So I actually had a completely different video idea in mind for today. But then a couple of days ago, a bit of news was announced that made me want to ditch that original idea and do a video on that thing, because it's something I've not really talked about that much on this channel, and I wanted to have the opportunity to talk about it because I like it so much. Basically, it was announced the other day that Paramount Studios will no longer be going forward with any more Star Trek films set within the J.J. Abrams continuity, which for fans is also referred to as the Kelvin timeline. Now, I want to address this straight out the gate. I am not a diehard Star Trek fan. I wouldn't deem myself a Trekkie. I just happen to love the J.J. Abrams trilogy that we got. These are the films that got me into Star Trek in the first place and made me want to delve further into Star Trek as a franchise because I enjoyed these three films so much. And now that we will not be getting any more films set within that timeline and with that specific cast, makes me quite sad, even though this is something I think a lot of us saw coming from a mile away. The last Star Trek film that we got within this timeline was in 2016 with Star Trek Beyond. And that's almost a decade ago. That's kind of mad to think that that was almost a decade ago, but that's true. That's the last time we got a Star Trek film within that timeline, and the fact that it's been 10 years or so since then kind of proves that the studio hasn't really known what to do since that film. And to be honest, there are a number of factors leading into that. The first and main one, from my perspective, being that in 2016, just before Star Trek Beyond came out, we lost Anton Yelchin, who played Chekhov in this trilogy. And he was quite an integral part of that crew, of that cast. And taking him out of the equation would immediately make a fourth film feel a bit strange, and I can immediately see the issues they probably would have had trying to bring a fourth film into existence, whilst also still trying to account for the fact that we no longer have Anton Yelchin. On top of that, when you look at the production history of Star Trek Into Darkness and Star Trek Beyond, those films alone took a while to come to fruition because they struggled to finalise an idea that they were all happy with. It took quite a few attempts for them to all agree on an idea that actually worked for the sake of a film, hence why there is a pretty noticeable gap between the release of Star Trek Into Darkness and Star Trek Beyond. And I can again see that being a major reason as to why we have not got a fourth Star Trek film with this cast. But coming from someone who's not a devoted Star Trek fan and only really came into the franchise through these films, I wanted to take this video to just look back at these three really fun, really entertaining movies and just talk about why I love them so much, because a lot of people, since the news came out, have been very quick to kind of brush these films aside because they're devoted Star Trek fans, and the view of these films from the main Star Trek fan base is a bit hit and miss. But I wanted to just come in as someone who's not a devoted Star Trek fan and just express my love for these films, because I've never really done that on this channel. I've reviewed all three of these films very briefly in the past when Star Trek Beyond originally came out in 2016, but I don't think those reviews do these films justice, and I wanted to do a one singular video where I do them justice finally. So let's obviously start things off with 2009's Star Trek. Now, I did not see this in the cinema. I kind of didn't see it in the cinema because I didn't really know what it was. It was not initially on my radar. I roughly knew what Star Trek was at the time, but not enough to go, oh my god, I have to see this in the cinema. And then after it came out, I saw a lot of the positive reviews it was getting from outlets like Empire and Total Film, and there was a lot of general buzz around it, which made me want to finally check it out when it was released on DVD. And I remember buying this film on DVD from Tesco's and sitting down with my dad, watching it in the living room, and I was just in awe of it. I think this was one of the first times that I'd seen a blockbuster film that genuinely delivered on scale and spectacle in a manner that I'd not really experienced before, but also had an unrivaled amount of energy in it, not just from its filmmaking, but from its story, its pacing, and especially its cast. And that, paired with the fact that just a few months later we got Avatar, those were like the two blockbuster standards for me. That was a very impressionable age for me when it came to my taste in film. Like, at that time, I was only just getting into film, and then seeing those two films back to back, one on DVD and then one in the cinema in 3D, blew my mind in terms of what blockbusters were capable of, in terms of really immersing you into these worlds and really delivering in terms of scale and wonder. On top of that, though, I think the one thing that Star Trek 2009 absolutely nails, and this is something you can carry over to the other two films as well, is its cast. I roughly knew of the original cast, like William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, all that lot, and I knew the stereotypes that had been set up around the way those characters were portrayed because they'd portrayed them so iconically. But going into this film, I completely forgot about them, and to me, considering I grew up with this trilogy, these are, to me, the definitive portrayals of these characters, because they gave these characters a new lease of life that was youthful, energetic, and they made these characters their own whilst also making them feel familiar to the portrayals that had come before with Shatner and Nimoy and co. You have Chris Pine, who's bringing a sort of cocky naivety to his portrayal of Captain Kirk. You've got Zachary Quinto, who is genuinely perfect as Spock. That was, I think, again, one of the other reasons why I wanted to watch this film, is because at the time, I was a massive fan of Heroes. And as most of you know, he played the serial killer Sylar in that show, and I was obsessed with his portrayal of that character from Heroes. But I think my favourite performance in this first film specifically, and he ends up becoming one of my favourite characters in the whole trilogy, is Karl Urban as Bones. The lines this guy comes out with are so perfect, and he delivers them with such a sarcastic, unsure, dry wit to them that he makes really mundane lines incredibly funny. He does it brilliantly in this first film, and then just kind of gets better as each film goes on. I think Karl Urban was born to play that character. On top of all of that, I think J.J. Abrams' direction of this first film is incredibly frantic, chaotic, and a little bit scrappy in places, but I think it works. And one thing that I was only really thinking about when looking back at these films from start to finish is that the style of direction from the original to Into Darkness, into Beyond, gets deliberately more cleaned up and less frantic as they go on, which matches where these characters are currently at in terms of their careers and how much they've progressed as people. For example, in the first film, they are all out of their depth, they are all inexperienced, so to speak, which therefore gives a reason for the style and the direction of the film and the camera work to be a little bit scrappy and a little bit jittery and all over the place. Into Darkness, we're a bit further along the line. They're still not professionals, but they're also still not as inexperienced as they were in the first film, which allows Abrams to go for a 50-50 balance in terms of the camera work, where he can dip a little bit back into that frantic approach he took for the first film, but when the time needs to, he can give slow-moving camera moves or actually keep the camera still for a few moments. And I really like that balance, because it's not perfect like the first film, but it's a lot more restrained than the first film. And then you have Star Trek Beyond, which was directed by Justin Lin, and that in terms of its camera movements and direction, does feel like a completely different beast to the first two, because he completely removes all of that handheld camera and chaotic motion from the first film, and instead we get smooth camera moves on dollies and pans and, you know, all these things that make it feel a bit more controlled and less hectic, which makes sense for where the crew are, because they're now very, very far into their 5-year journey and they now kind of know what they're doing. These are the characters that we know them to be from the original series, not amateurs or not cadets from the first film. It's a very subtle little thing, and I'm not sure if it's actually intended to be analysed in that way, but when you watch these 3 films back to back and subconsciously think about that aspect and where these characters are in terms of their progress in their 5-year journey, it makes so much sense. Across all 3 films, you have Michael Giacchino working his arse off to deliver some of the best scores he's ever done in his entire career. The score he did for the first film, which I have here on vinyl because I love it so much, this is genuinely one of my favourite scores of all time. I love what he did with this score. It feels nostalgic and whimsical and adventurous, but also when he needs to lean into emotion or darkness, he does so and it feels effortless, and it never takes away from that whimsical, adventurous nature that he establishes with the main theme, or the theme that he established for this film called Enterprising Young Men, which is one of my favourite pieces of a film score, full stop. It's so good. But then when we get to Into Darkness and beyond, he is able to introduce other elements and other themes that feel fitting for the tone he set in the first film, but also feel refreshing and different. For example, Harrison's theme from Into Darkness, or even London Calling, are very chilling and threatening pieces, but again feel very fitting within this universe. For me, the 2009 original will always be my favourite, because it felt like a very lightning in a bottle sort of thing, but no matter how many times I go back and rewatch it, I get that same sort of giddy feeling again, and it never quite leaves, and it just makes me immediately want to rewatch it again as soon as it's finished. Then you have Star Trek Into Darkness, which I absolutely loved when I saw it in the cinema, and I still really like it to this day. I realise this film is incredibly divisive with Star Trek fans and just fans in general. For me, this is a film that I can completely understand that it is flawed. There are cracks in every angle of this movie. No matter how you try to view it, there are issues with it. But I can watch this as a sort of turn your brain off sort of fun blockbuster action film, which I guess isn't how Star Trek should be. But for the sake of this film, I can really enjoy it in places. I think Benedict Cumberbatch is a brilliant addition to this ensemble. The second film as well also features one of my favourite scenes from the entire trilogy, which is when the Enterprise has lost all power. Meanwhile, inside the Enterprise, Kirk and Scott are trying to get to the warp reactor whilst trying to navigate an Enterprise that is spinning in midair. So 1 minute they're walking on the wall and then the ceiling, and then they have to hold on for dear life while the Enterprise is completely upside down. That scene floored me when I saw it back in 2012 or 2013, whenever the film came out, and I still rewatch that scene every once in a while because I just love it so much. And then you have Star Trek Beyond, which is one that doesn't get talked about nearly as much compared to the first two, which I think is a shame, because even though you don't have the same level of energy that Abrams brought to the first two, I still think Justin Lin does a brilliant job with this film. And I think the way that it really dissects the dynamics of the crew by splitting them up, I think is a genius choice. And I think the pairings that they go for in this film are also kind of genius. Two of my favourite pairings in the entire film are Kirk being paired with Chekhov and Spock being paired with Bones, that pairing alone is hilarious and leads to some of the funniest moments of the entire trilogy. One, because they don't get on with each other at all, but also the way those two portray those characters is just spot on. And I also think that even though the way this film concludes, it does open the door to future sequels, but considering that we never got a fourth film and we're never going to get a fourth film now, I think the ending does kind of work in terms of it, you know, adding a nice bow on this little trilogy that we got that may not work for die-hard Star Trek fans, but I think worked for audiences as a whole. If you've seen these Star Trek films, let me know what you think about them in the comments below, and let me know as well if you're sad about the news that we will no longer get any films set within the Kelvin timeline. Personally, I'm quite sad, even though I kind of saw this coming from a mile away. If you like the video, then give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And I will see you all in the next one. Bye.